in Qatar as well.
Absolutely, inshallah, very soon.
With you, you're an advisor to QFC on our strategic roadmap for Islamic finance, and you have a good overview on what needs to be done. So the question to you is, how are stakeholders driving the digitalization or innovation in Islamic financial services industry, and what sort of ESG for financial institutions and customers?
Thank you, Henk, and pleasure being here, and thank you for the IFSB and then QCB and Qatar Financial Centre for hosting this very interesting and timely event. So I think a lot of things have been said in terms of fintech developments and also the challenges when it comes to sustainability. And we see that the key stakeholders here are, of course, financial institutions, regulators, fintechs, but also academic institutions, and then of innovations when we talk about, the demand side coming to customers and both investors. Now let's start with the challenges. If we look at the global landscape now, key challenges, there is the mobilization for climate change, obviously, and then meeting the SDG agenda by 2030. And then for that, there is an investment gap of about 2.5 trillion by that, deadline. And adding to that, some of the reports will mention a higher figure of going up to $4 trillion. So that means that the role of the private sector is critical in meeting that funding gap, and particularly the financial sector. And that's why we see more and more, I would say, pressure or incentives to incentivize actually in financial institutions to innovate more and contribute more to sustainable finance. Now, looking at ESG specifically, I think a few years back, the starting point was CSR. So a lot of institutions would have their CSR or the industries they are actually supporting. But that trend has changed to ESG integration. And now we're talking to the broader sustainability integration, which actually starts from the mission and the vision of the institutions to their operational activities. Now, some countries have worked on those to sustainability through a number of course, regulations and conducive environments for that. And that means for financial institutions that it really requires a paradigm shift on how they conduct financial intermediation. So looking into how they decide on their strategic priorities as institution and how they redirect to certain sectors or activities that support that objective. And that means a lot of data or ESG data is needed for decision making for these institutions. Now we've seen some big institutions have developed their own departments for that purpose, but smaller size institutions can perfectly rely on other providers, and this is where we see the role of fintechs in facilitating this role. And number one, in terms of providing ESG data for decision making, but also to facilitate sustainable finance products innovation. Another challenge has been added following the pandemic, and it's also relevant for regulators and particularly central banks to promote financial stability, which is the resilience issue. And we've seen that some of the suffered during the pandemic since they didn't have access to enough alternative financing to actually meet their funding obligations. And these include SMEs, farmers, and of course, other smaller categories like women entrepreneurs, etc. So there is a huge potential for fintechs in terms of facilitating ESG integration for financial institutions, both through the quality of data that they can provide and support financial institutions for decision making, but also on the alternative financing mechanisms that can help them actually cater for the specific needs for these vulnerable groups.
Thank you very much. I hear clearly a message to the financial institutions. Get ready, make sure that you have teams that can handle these challenges, work together with fintech, and hopefully the regulators will facilitate that. I think the speech of the governor was clearly that, the trend is innovation. So now we go to a practitioner, Nizamuddin, Chief Strategy Officer from Algebra. A very promising fintech in the UK. So my question to you is Algebra any other wallets or digital banks? And what is the wish of your customers or your future customers? And does ESG play a role for them?
Thank you, Hank. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. IFSB for having us. So Algebra is a fintech that helps connect consumers with their values. And I say it in that order, that is also Sharia compliance. And the reason why we phrase it in that way is because we fundamentally believe the role of Islamic finance to be an enabler for ESG. And the two have to be completely connected. And so before I answer your question of how is Algebra revolutionary, I think it's important to understand the context of Islamic finance. In the UK, where we're obviously, we're regulated, alhamdulillah, so Algebra is the first fintech that is Sharia compliant to have a full EMI license from the FCA, which we received this year, which is really wonderful news. Consumer perspective, that may in some way be exposed to a defense industry, for example. Now, we are not telling our consumers that this is good, this is bad, but rather what we're doing is giving them the ability to decide whether they wish to engage in financial activity that is within their values or not. So I think the technology piece is really, really important, and doing that right is incredibly important. The other really important piece from a Algebra perspective that we worked really hard on is to build a team that is really focused on compliance. And so I think one of the challenges that we have right now is getting the basics right. Good quality team that understands the functions of what the consumers want. And so we have worked really hard to build out a community function where we have the authenticity and trust of our communities. We have incredible outreach with the community in the United Kingdom in particular. And again, the reason why we do that is because we want them to understand that we are a financial institution. So I started with that fact. I think it's important to get the basics right before you become revolutionary. From an ESG perspective, I think it's really remarkable where the world is headed. Within a global context, we see movements emerging which are shaping what consumers are expecting of us. So last year, we, as Algebra, authored a report with MasterCard called the Values and Lifestyles Report, helping understand the overlooked communities in the UK. So the global figure that we have in terms of our global mission, and it's a mission for all of us. So when we think about ESG from panelists and Dr. Bello earlier, you have a global number that is 1.7 billion people that are unbanked in the world. When you break that down in terms of who is addressable, especially through technology, it's 1.3 billion people. Of that 1.3 billion people, 800 million are Muslim. And so there is a mission globally to address that S. From an Algebra perspective, we think that's incredibly important. Take that to Europe, where we are starting out, and the reason why we're starting out in Europe is because, one, we are from the being regulated in the UK allows us to have a foundation, allows us to go to the world, but it may not be unbanked. So when we think about unbanked, we think no bank account. But there are 4.5 million Muslims in the UK, there are 30 million Muslims in Europe, all of whom have faith-based needs that are currently being unmet. So they are underserved and they are underbanked. And so from an Algebra perspective, one of the things that we want to do from an ESG perspective is to make sure that community group is catered for. And I think what we're seeing, when you combine that with movements like Black Lives Matter, Greta Thunberg, when she does Fridays for the Future marches across the street, you have a young generation now that have really high expectations of their consumerism. They expect products not just speak to their values, which means consumers are expecting far more from us, and we have to be able to cater to them. And I think that's really, really, really important. So how are we doing that? I'll give you two examples of how we're doing that as a company. Algebra is the only fintech, certainly in Europe for now. On our app, you can track your carbon footprint, and in a single user journey, offset that footprint as well. And that means, and we're not making a song and dance about it, because what we're not looking to do is tell you this is all, it's going to be completely normal. I think the future of finance won't have ESG in it. ESG will be fully embedded into what we expect from a financial institution. So from an Algebra product, what you can see on the platform is the ability to track your carbon, offset your carbon in a single journey. And what's really, really important in the way we are building the E and the S together, that's the E. On the S front, we see the recent floods in Pakistan. Pakistan contributes, from a contribution perspective, it contributes one of the least amounts of carbon into the environment and climate change, yet is part of the 10 most affected countries in the entire world. Of that 10, depending on which measure you look at, 5 countries are Muslim majority countries. So when you look at the intersectionality between the E and the S, you realize and you understand how important it is, one, to build a platform which raises that awareness from a consumer perspective, giving them the tools to do something about it, which is really, really equally important. And all of that without compromising on the quality of providing financial services. So as Algebra, we take all those things really seriously. And I could go on, and I'm conscious that you're looking at me like...
Yeah, so I think with WITAC and Algebra, can we already download your app in this part of the world?
Everyone can download it for email, and we can have a look at onboarding you. But it's for now, it's usage.
Okay, that's probably if you have a European address, you can start working. So yeah, all the best. I think it's very promising, not only for but probably also the younger generations like Gen Z, millennials that would like to have ethical and fair financial services. So by now, I think you have a good understanding what ESG means in terms of innovation. So there's a question to barcode or QR code. You have to look at the small card, not the program QR code. If you are kind enough to scan it, and there will be 2 questions, and the questions are formulated by the College of Islamic Affairs, and we would like to get your input, and that the College of Islamic Affairs of HPQU will publish later this year. So hopefully you can doing that already, which is good. Then I have to look at the organization. Will we show this on the screen? So please, if you find the 2 questions, there are 2 questions with simple yes or no answers. Hopefully you can make them. Meanwhile, we will move to the second part of our round, for which you all have a few minutes to answer because we have to look at the time. 1 second remaining. Okay, so this is based on you.